video on my side.
We're live.
Hello, everybody.
Hello, everyone. It's Wednesday.
It is. It's good to see you, Lisa.
Good seeing you, Josh. We had a fun conversation over on Instagram a while ago.
Yes, we did. And of course, on this Wednesday night, we welcome everybody to the Dark Ozarks.
And it's a part 2 this week because we didn't get through near everything on our list last week. So so we're doing Ghost Hunter's Guide to the Ozarks Part 2.
Yes, and at the rate that we're going, we may have multiple parts, and we'll just see where this goes. A lot of really, really fascinating locations. And then I don't know about you, but the more we talk about this, the more there's more locations that I want to go check out.
Oh, definitely. We may have to kind of go to maybe the Ghost Hunter's Guide is a monthly event. We just do it once a month.
Yeah, I think that'd be a lot of fun, and we might actually, as our schedules allow, see what locations we couldn't, go to in between. Yeah, and do potentially do a little bit of research. I think it's important to talk about this a little bit. Many of the locations, not all, some of the locations, like we were discussing, the Old English Inn is a very public location. It's an open hotel in downtown Hollister. It's also a great restaurant. So there's a lot of people. The public is invited into that space. Pretty much 11 a.m. until 10 p.m. 5 days a week. And then
for spending the night.
yes, folks can book rooms. I'm going to do that soon. I don't know when. I keep threatening to actually stay there. And for folks who are like, you're not going there because it's haunted. No, I'm not going there because I have a perfectly good 1,300 square foot house 1 mile away. My mindset is that I book hotel rooms when I travel, and I literally could walk home if I needed to. But at the same time, I really want to stay there.
It is. It's a great place to stay. It's a great experience. And, if you don't do it soon, one time we're up there, I'm just going to have to throw you in a room, lock it, throw a camera at you and tell us what happened. So.
Exactly. I'll bring a box of books and I'll read stories to the ghosts.
There you go. Actually, it's not a bad idea. Sometimes things like that really kind of stir up activity.
I know. It reminds me, complete non sequitur. Being quite excited when I was young and finally learning how to read. And my first big endeavor of learning how to read was I took several books out to the barn and started reading stories to the goats. Well,
there you go. It worked.
They enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. It was a good mix. So a lot of fun. But public spaces, obviously some locations that we have the opportunity to go to are not public spaces.
Right.
They are private. So I think it's important, what are the ground rules for investigating?
And to me, it changes a little bit if it's a public space versus a private space. And I guess it kind of depends on what kind of public space, now that I think about it. But one is be respectful. And know that it's not as exciting as it looks on TV as far as thrills and antics, particularly because you are in someone else's property, you are in someone else's space, especially if it's a home and people are living there, or a place where someone's running a business. People want to, quote, stir up activity, but at the same time, you go home at the end of the night and those people come in the next day or later that night and they have to deal with whatever you did. And
Yeah.
so it's not all fun and games. It's not entertainment the way it's portrayed on TV at times.
Hmm. That is 100% true, and there is a thrill-seeking patina
Yeah.
to it that the real life typically does not live up to.
No. And in fact, people who decide they want to ghost hunt for the thrill seeking aspect of it usually don't stay in the field very long because
No.
it doesn't really work that way. Um, one, you don't really get very good results usually.
Hmm.
And two, it's much more methodical, mundane, and the bad W word work. You know, you have to put in hours and review evidence and you're going back and talking to clients and everything. It's not that I went through a spooky dark building at midnight and went home and told stories about it.
Right. Again, and I think that sort of the traditional Halloween uh, scare house, spook house type of commercial endeavor, which is, for the record, an enormous amount of fun. I actually
Yeah.
enjoyed volunteering at those locations more than I enjoyed going on them. It was much more fun to scare people than to be scared.
Hmm.
But this type of work um, is vastly different from that.
It is. It's people don't want to think about it, but it's research.
Mhm.
Uh, and it's a lot of observation.
Yes, yes.
Excuse me.
And it,
My allergies are catching up with me today. Yeah.
we've we've just been um, taking turns with a variety of allergic responses to the Ozarks around us. And
Yes.
it's just part of it. And for people who might be outside of the Ozarks, you look at the beautiful vistas of the Ozarks, and they're full of trees. And I love those trees, but those trees create a interesting series of pollens,
Most
and
days I do.
and also considering the amount of rain that we've been getting, an interesting amount of mold as
Yeah,
well.
that's
Uh,
true.
just innately happening in nature. So it's the Ozarks are a beautiful, but they can be a very harsh environment.
They can. I mean, they really can. I think that's a defining factor, really.
Hmm.
And
It is.
um, and maybe a little bit afterlife as well.
Yes, I think that's not impossible. And of course, I think all the locations that we're talking about are pretty public. Some of them might be close to the public under normal circumstances, but we do not remotely encourage people to wing it,
No,
and you do not trespass. You do not go places without permission from the owners and that sort of thing.
no, urban exploring is not ghost hunting.
Right, right, and legitimacy of research. Such a big part of that is is going through appropriate channels. Um, no matter how many times some of you have seen Sam and Dean, get out their bolt cutters from the Impala and let themselves into some location. Doesn't we don't get to do that in the real life, and neither do you.
No, the county sheriff doesn't look at things that way. Whatever
and
county it is.
and and whomever you are, you don't have plot armor. So you don't have plot armor, and your script writers are not working for CW. So it doesn't work that way in the real life. We've got a number of locations to talk about. One we've got here on the list we might jump right into is the Pythian Castle in Springfield.
That's a great place. And sort of an aside, if you know the history, of course, it's not a castle. Originally was it was a hospital. I forget what they treated. I don't think it was a TB hospital.
No, it during the I believe during the war, it was used as a medical facility, but it was started as a fraternal order for the Pythians, as essentially a retirement location, and also for orphans.
Right.
And you know, back in the day, and I think the Pythian order still exists, but it was a very substantial order back at the turn of the 20th century, and the idea that the individuals, gentlemen, would pay their membership dues for this fraternal order, with the understanding that not only could they go to these various locations for fellowship with, you know, individuals, but that if anything were to happen to them, that their wife, their widow, or their orphan children would have a place that they could be cared for.
It very much was a community organization to help its members and members' families in hard times.
Yeah, and you think about. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that during the Second World War, then it was a prisoner of war hospital for German prisoners.
Yes, and at one point, apparently, a stop for, you know, kind of almost a barracks type location for soldiers getting ready to go overseas. So it just an odd mix of histories for the location.
Yes, and I don't know if I've told you the story, but I almost bought it.
I do remember you saying that. Yes.
It was the early 90s, and the city owned it, and they decided to sell it because it was costing them more to try to keep it open. Well, it wasn't even open. Keep it going. Then they were making off of it, so they were doing a silent auction, and my ex-husband and I decided, we might put a bid in, but very young, didn't have much money, and we had $5,000 or something we could spare, and the last minute kind of backed out. Oh, it'll go for more than that. Ended up there was one bid, $4,001.
Wow.
And the fellow that got it, he lived in it. He kind of renovated 2 or 3 rooms, lived in those rooms, kept it for several years, and then turned around and sold it to the current owner for a hefty profit.
It's, of course, it would be cool to own a castle, even if it wasn't a castle. And for people who may not be aware, it's really in kind of the middle, sort of east from the Springfield Square, but pretty decidedly in the heart of urban Springfield.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it's pretty much downtown Springfield. Now, when it was built, I'm not, I'm sure it was sort of on the outskirts.
It was. I know when, and it was. Oh, don't shoot me for not remembering when it was built, but after the turn of the 20th century. And one of I remember one of the points of interest with its construction was that they were going to extend the trolley line all the way out to the Pythian Castle as
Mm-hmm.
sort of a big moment of urban expansion for modern Springfield, and around, I want to say around 1920 as an
Yeah,
approximate.
and it's also interesting that now if you go there, and if for people who don't really know where it is, it's sort of of course it's surrounded by things built up around it, and it's easy to not realize where it is if you're not familiar with it.
It is, and but I think it comes by its name. Honestly, it really does look like a castle,
Mm-hmm. It does. It
and
has the facade.
it does, and made from locally quarried quartz limestone,
Mm-hmm.
which has mm, energetic qualities potentially to it.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, an enormous amount of history of simply many varied groups of people, uh, elderly, the very young, uh, soldiers, prisoners of war, mostly German, one Japanese prisoner of war during World War
Right.
II. Um, just a wide variety of people over the generations, over the history of the 20th century, passing through this space that seems to have contributed to paranormal activity there.
I think so. Plus, I mean, just the whole area around there, now, I mean, when it was built, it was kind of on the edge of nothing, but the everything around it has now been there about 100 years. So you
Yeah,
have, you know, people get caught up in the footprint of a building and what happened had to happen in those four walls, and that's not necessarily the case either. So you have a long established neighborhood aside from the building and its unique history, and definitely an imposing structure that I think those kind of places leave an impression on us, and we tend to leave an impression on them.
yeah, I would agree, very much agree on that. We've got an article on the Pythian Castle on State of the Ozarks.
Uh-huh.
Had the opportunity to um, go on a tour. It's I lose track of time. It was quite some time ago now. I was realizing that because I was reviewing photos this morning, and and went, wow, that was a while back. Um, for me, it was the opportunity I went on. It was it was kind of interesting. It was a mostly couples Halloween tour. What it was, and I was there as a journalist, along with one of our interns for the experience. So that was a little bit odd man out on that. Um, but there was that was really where I think I gained a great deal of insight in terms of watching the tour itself, because I was primarily there as photographer, and so it was my job simply to observe and watching the process where these couples um, initially were for the most part, it was a date night. It was like we were doing this after Applebee's sort of thing, and I and then uh, so very very casual. This was not, and approaching it from from a very different mindset, I think, than how I was approaching it, or typically how I tend to approach these spaces, which almost that they are sacred liminal spaces
Mhm.
that may or may not have something that they want to tell us, that it wants to tell us, which is a very different headspace. And So a lot of joking, a lot of sort of ribbing each other, like, oh, this is so spooky, and then the host began sharing some very grounded stories of personal experiences, individuals, having, for example, having, like the construction drapery down and going to walk through it and basically encountering a standing body that is, there, and then you open it up and there's nothing there. um the story of a man who grew up was a little boy, I believe, in the 60s, after the castle was empty,
Mhm.
who had grown up in the adjoining neighborhood, in the suburban neighborhood next door, and then relating later that as a small child he would go over and crawl into the basement, and in his words, to go play with the kids,
Yeah.
and then someone else saying, what are you talking about, the place is empty, and he's like, that's funny, they always rolled the ball back to me when I rolled it to them.
Mm.
um and as these stories started to unfold, you could see sort of I'm going to say this, and I don't mean it completely. This is a little bit of hyperbole, but sort of the color drained from everybody's faces, where they're sitting there going, I signed up for a cool, spooky, cornfield experience, where the scarecrow is going to jump out, but it's really just a guy. And suddenly I'm being faced with the possibility that all of the neat, tidy boxes that I have in my mind about how the world works might not work like that. And it became very somber very quickly.
I've seen those lids many times on tours. I often say, um, how a tour will go at a haunted place really depends on who is there. Um, and it's always interesting because you often will get someone there that has been drug along. They were drug along on date night, didn't want to go, or whatever. And sometimes they try to make light, oh ha ha type thing, and then as things unfold, you see the change in their demeanor, and then they suddenly, and then often it's those people, they are the ones who by the end of the night are sitting down asking you a bunch of questions.
Which is, it's, and I think that's very rewarding. I love the aspects of this that simply force us to think beyond what we think we know.
That's very true, and I think, for one thing, whether it's at a spook house or it's watching a movie at a theater or on TV at home, it is a very insulated experience, because by definition it can't affect you. But
Yes.
when you're in that space and you start realizing things that have happened to people there, then people start thinking, this could happen to me.
Yes. Yes.
And it changes the demeanor.
It does. It does. And by de facto, not only could this happen to me, but if it does, what does that mean to, for example, my worldview?
Exactly. Now where do all the boxes fit?
Yes, and the either the unsettling or the exhilarating thing is they don't. That's the troubling thing for people.
Where there are no
I
boxes.
No, there may not. So the boxes simply are a construct. It's and it's probably the reason I love the first Matrix movie so much. I there is no spoon. Um, and I think that's a beautiful first step
Mhm.
to the potentialities that exist. And I think that, of course, I'm going off on a tangent. Sorry. Is this I think that the beginning of humility in all reality begins with this point. I think that we have an enormous amount of sort of put your blinders on hubris based on the fact that we are convinced we know.
Well, we're convinced we know, and we're convinced we're sophisticated and modern, and we have the answers.
Yes, not like those silly people 50 years ago or 100 years ago.
Exactly.
And and a handful of those people are probably haunting your house. So that's
Very true.
one interesting dynamic. And the fact that as you go further and further back, in terms of sort of this um, celestial meanings of things, it appears strongly, is strongly suggested that the further you get back, the less primitive human thought was about larger celestial or existential realities.
Well, that I agree. It's there was more general contemplation of those larger concepts. Um, and for one reason, to be perfectly honest, they played a more direct role in people's lives. Um, Understanding the constellations and the moon cycles, etc., uh, pretty much ruled people's lives for hundreds of thousands of years.
It
Where
did.
now, if you know, most people couldn't tell you where the Big Dipper or the Little Dipper was, much less anything else, or um, what was a waxing or waning moon or whatever, and what does it mean, and what does it mean for planting or travel or anything else.
Yes, very, very much so. And things that our more ancient peoples would have taken for granted, we are ignorant of, while
Mhm.
patting ourselves on the back about how incredibly sophisticated and educated we are. It's a completely different type of knowledge, and but I think something has largely been lost. Something else that I find really interesting. I mean, this has nothing to do with our topic list, but we'll come back to that in just a second. But I'm going to throw this out here, of a commonality of ancient social structures typically included what, for lack of a better word, was the shaman, the
Mhm.
the mediator. The shaman existed as a liminal being, as a mediator between this world and the next.
Mhm.
And this is a role that we do not have a modern equivalent for.
Not really. We really don't. And for those that might say perhaps modern religion plays that role, it's really not. It's something separate.
It is. It's largely separate, and this is not a knock against modern religion. I want to be very clear
No.
about that. But it's saying, something I realized a while back, or began to contemplate on, is that role of shaman, of that liminal being that is both very much in this world and then able to step into the next,
Right.
is, as an archetypal role. We don't have someone in that space. And
No. And I'm even trying to think of some examples of, say in movies or anything that are modern day, where you would say that someone really fits that role. And at least at the moment, I'm not coming up with any.
it's largely, to me anyway, it's incredibly important. And I don't use the term archetypal um, lightly in this case. I think it is a crucial part of the human experience. I think it's very, very important that these individuals exist within a social structure, but our industrialized society says that superstition, we don't need it. It no longer exists.
I think that's a fair point. I hadn't really thought about that before, but And perhaps maybe that's why, we do get some strange looks on tours, because often if you are in the field for long, and particularly if you deal with the public related to the paranormal, you do kind of talk in those terms a bit, and you do get a little askance looks that that this does not compute. That, I mean, it is true,
Right.
because you have to contemplate the now versus the other as well.
It is, and I would perhaps hesitantly posit that a lot of our interest in the paranormal is really a desire to reconnect with that sort of the shaman archetype, and the need to connect with the other in some sort of way. But we don't have a lot, we don't have a social structure to support it.
I think that's fair. I do think that's fair, and you do see people who are really drawn to it with that kind of yearning. Um, and that, I think that's something that we probably ought to explore further down the line, as well. I think that's an interesting topic.
It's and of course, I think, in to some small degree, any of us who pick up the mantle of responsibility, but are also, willing to sometimes deal with those askance looks, and but do this kind of research and do this kind of work, to, at least in some small part, we are, beginning to embody that role again.
I hope so anyway. I mean, in a way, I say that a little hesitantly, because it's almost it seems a little arrogant in a way to assume that kind of role. But I
Mhm.
think, there needs to be some sort of bridging of that role somehow.
Mhm. And of course, uh, coming back to our list.
Interesting tangent, by the way.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Emphasis on interesting, not necessarily good, but at least interesting. But I've increasingly been thinking about that as we do what we do, and again, I'm very hesitant. I don't, to step in and say, oh, this is the role that I'm playing, because I don't think, I think that would be a disservice to the past.
Yeah.
But in terms of at times embodying small facets of the need,
Hmm.
I think that the potential is there.
I do too.
Um, jumping to some sort of Ozarks borderlands. It's almost outside of our range, but it's not. Is in St. Joe, Missouri,
Mhm.
with the medical museum that's there. I've not been there. I'm really interested to go.
The Glore Psychiatric Museum. Um, Basically, the hospital is there, but now they have a museum separate, and it's basically a museum of the history of psychiatry and psychiatric treatment and so forth. And it is well known to be haunted. They actually do have public ghost hunts there for people who are interested. Um, and I do think it represents, an aspect that people don't always think about, but I think it, its activity is more about attachments than active hauntings. I mean, there may
Mhm.
be, because the hospital was right there, but you have this collection of equipment and so forth that, um, was used with patients with very severe conditions. And then, of course, at times you had people that were in asylums that today they wouldn't be. They just didn't have any other place to go.
Yeah.
Um, and unfortunately, 100, 150 years ago, people were kind of, if they didn't fit in, sometimes they kind of were left in those situations.
Yes.
And so you have very real, um, emotional trauma, um, high intensity emotions and problems. And I think it's very likely that there's attachments with some of those items.
Yeah. And for people who may not be aware, it seems that, again, when there's those really high emotions involved in some way, that a spirit can become attached to an object.
Yeah, or at least part of the energy. Almost think of if you have a lucky coin or a lucky rock that you carry around. Someone carries it in their pocket for 50 years. Or grandpa's pocket watch is a good example. Grandpa carried a pocket watch for 50 years and it's handed down in the family. And often those kind of objects, people will express that they feel energy off of, or a presence, that it's not like handling a regular pocket watch. Uh,
Yeah.
and and it really has to do with that we are energetic beings, and that we affect other energy and other matter, um, and we can deposit energy, uh, even emotion or senses of emotion. Think of a phonograph record, um, that perhaps can be played again with a phonograph needle. Um, it works kind of the same way.
Yes, it does. And it's hard to, I think, sometimes, because we can't necessarily see energy. It's hard to, for some people, to wrap their heads around that it exists. But
Right.
at the same time,
I think the best example that people probably relate to are dolls.
yes.
That there are dolls that just are creepy, that affect people, and they don't have to be Annabelle or anything like that, but that, and then some people are just creeped out by dolls in general. Um,
Right.
and so there is a whole lore that's grown up about attachments to dolls and them being vessels for souls and so forth. But it
Mhm.
doesn't have to just be a doll.
No, no, it does not. The idea that, and in something that, I think an interesting amount of spell work is actually associated with imbuing objects with certain things.
Exactly. And of course that made some people uncomfortable, that people can actually do that, or and so that comes down to people say, oh, that's hogwash. That's not real. Um, but um, you know, now most people can't cast a spell, the way they do in some movies that, have dramatic effect on things. But um, can we affect things around us through thought and energy? I mean,
Absolutely.
exactly. And I think a good example is, and we kind of used this earlier, walk into a room, or someone walks into a room and everyone turns and looks at them.
Yes. You've affected the room.
They affected the room whether it was conscious or not.
Exactly. 100%. And we've all had the experience of walking into a space in which someone was really upset and instantly knowing it.
Yes. Or you walk into space and the air just feels so heavy. Everyone knows that, the air was heavy, and not just
Yes.
in the sense of maybe it was humid, but
No.
uh, and it's just the energy in the air. And we instinctively understand that, although we're not as good at putting that into words as I think we were in times past.
I would agree. And now, and I think this is a really interesting theme from the Glore Psychiatric Museum in St. Joe. But moving down to your neck of the woods, your part of the Ozarks, is the old state asylum in Nevada, and then also the county TB hospital in your area. And I know there's a lot of interesting things associated with both of those locations.
Yes. The the state hospital, it's closed, in Nevada, was actually started as the state lunatic asylum number 3. in
That's
the 1880s. And it really the asylum system through America really developed in the 1800s as a
hmm
consequence of society growing and becoming more complex. Um, it became more important, and you notice we're not necessarily talking just in psychiatric terms here. Became more important as there was more industrialization, because where families tended to care for people at home previously, it became harder for a lot of people to do so. And
hmm
so it was seen as a public health need to care for people. And the asylum system was started with all good intent, but often they became overcrowded, often had people there that ended up, they were there more, they should have, uh, as a poor farm than as an asylum sometimes. Um, Sometimes just because they didn't have anyone left to care for
And it's there's a really
them.
interesting commentary.
Huh?
What's that?
I said, so conditions tended to deteriorate over time.
Yes, and something I find really interesting. We look back at at sort of the, I mean, at this point, the abandoned asylum motif is its own horror genre.
Yes, yes.
And
And there are a number of them that are destinations for paranormal investigation and tours across the country.
yes, and at the same time, at the I believe at the onset of sort of the asylum building process, they would have been seen as extremely modern,
Hmm.
as a symbol of civilization,
Hmm.
and as a step into the future, as a step into modernity, and these magnificent Gothic edifices that they were creating was designed as a symbol of that. It was this was these were, for contemporary eyes at the onset, this would have been something for the community to celebrate and have a ribbon cutting in front of, and to imbue the public with a sense of confidence, where it's now indelibly stuck in our mind as a Gothic horror show.
Yeah. Yes. Now they tend to inspire that sense of Saturday morning spook, on Scooby Doo, the house with the bats flying out. But that's not what they were at the time. And it's also us looking back through the lens of hearing horror stories.
Yes.
And and there were some. I mean, there were, you had people that had very, very severe mental illness that they didn't have adequate means to treat,
hmm
medically. But it was seen as a step forward for most people having to care for them at home, and that usually meant locking them in a room.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
I
Which could become horrific as
Yeah,
well.
it really could. The I investigated a Victorian home once that um, upstairs was a room with a door with a lot, several, three locks on the outside, and there was a slit in the door that would have been probably for a tray to slide through, and then uh, above it a circle cut out. And
Yeah.
the owner really going trying to figure out what this would have been used for, and was a little horrified when I told her most likely they had. I mean, it would have been a fairly well-to-do family from the home, probably that they had a mentally ill or disabled family member that they cared for at home.
Yes. And locked them in.
And sometimes, you know, and we think, oh my gosh, that's how horrible. But there were, I mean, there were occasions of, you know, that would have, if they didn't, they'd be in the streets and wandering, and there are those kind of situations too, where that I know of, where you know, you had someone with mental illness in the 1800s, and the police are called, and they're wandering the street, and the neighbors are calling, and that kind of thing. And so it sounds horrific, but then if you think about the, you know, the situation, it's what they had to deal with, and so the asylums were seen as a step forward.
It is, yeah. So what sort of activity is associated with this location?
Um, it has been for decades and decades has been reported as haunted by people who worked there when it was still operational, as well as afterwards. There's not a lot of access at this point, though. Um, People will say they see shadows, um, figures in white clothing, presumably a nurse or something, lots of voices, sounds of someone crying or screaming at times in parts of some of the buildings. Some of the oldest buildings have been taken down. So um, a couple of the buildings that reputedly were most haunted aren't there now. So
It's I there's so many places I want to visit, and I have not had the chance to visit nearly as many of them as I want to. Um, but one of the locations here that we have that we're talking about was jumping out of Fort Smith,
yes, and
and
Fort Smith is just has interesting history. For one thing, again, in today's sort of removed world from the 1800s, we just don't think about it. But Fort Smith was named that because it started out as a fort on the
yeah,
frontier, and it started out as a fort to secure the western border, um, and to try to keep a lid on feuding Indian tribes, particularly the Osage and the Cherokee, that tended to go to war with each other a lot. Um,
yeah,
and then its other purpose was to serve as a jumping off point to settle the West further, stagecoaches, etc., for
mhm,
commerce and so forth. Because you needed a secure place to be able to conduct business.
yes,
And you, and at that time in the early 1800s, you were hundreds of miles from quote civilizations.
right,
It
and
starts out that way, and then of course it saw activity during the Civil War and so forth. But I think the most interesting period to me is the 1870s and 80s with Judge Isaac
yes,
Parker. Uh,
and of course by this time, Fort Smith's location on the Arkansas-Oklahoma border was at the time the Arkansas Indian Territory border, correct?
yes, yes. Basically, west of there was Indian Territory, not Oklahoma.
Hmm.
And if we think of places that are lawless now, Indian Territory in the 1800s after the Civil War was about as lawless as you got. Um,
Yes.
there was, practically speaking, there was no law enforcement.
Hmm.
Um, you had, I think it's 90 different tribes on reservations. Um, and then pretty much every outlaw that got in trouble somewhere else in this part of the country would head to Indian Territory, because it basically was no man's land. So it got so bad that they decided they had to do something. So um, they gave Judge Parker authority um, to basically um, rule on cases for Western Arkansas and all of Indian Territory. So basically, he had U.S. Marshals at his disposal, and they would go into Indian Territory to retrieve outlaws and bring them back to Fort Smith. And of course, he's famously known as the hanging judge.
Yes.
Because he actually did. They actually did hang multiple people on the gallows at once, and in large part that was as a show of we are going to put a lid on things.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, like we think of the hangings again, just like we think of the not just like, but I'm drawing some similarities here, which I really had not thought of.
Mm-hmm.
We look at the asylum and we see it as a gothic horror, but at the time, this was modern civilization's answer to a problem. And
Yes.
and with I think something that you just hit on with Judge Parker, certainly I suspect um, from Parker's perspective is he is bringing civilization.
Well, and certainly, I mean, and certainly did, and the number of of hangings was not as many as you kind of imagine from the infamy. I want to say it was around 70.
Mm-hmm.
But you hear, oh, hanging Judge Parker, and it's this larger than life thing. But he was willing to do that, and he had that power as a federal judge at the
Yeah.
time. And so you weren't you were not, particularly when dealing with the territory, you weren't sitting in jail waiting for appeals back east and that kind of thing. Is that Judge Parker's decision was the law.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
and so it did have a settling effect. And um, some of the some of the iconic characters that came out of sort of our myth later in the media are from that. And one of those would be the Lone Ranger, which is actually patterned on one of his U.S. Marshals,
Wow.
and who ironically was black. He was a black man
That.
in real life, and he ironically he brought his own son in for murder.
Oh my gosh. Mm.
And so it's really sort of those legend, those archetypal characters. We think, oh, that's just fiction, but in reality, they really weren't. There were a few of them that really did kind of stand up to that test.
It's and that is all to me that's really really phenomenal when we find that, because of course throughout history, and our focus is on obviously history associated with the Ozarks and Americana, but throughout history you'll find individuals whose real lives far exceeded the for example the pulp fiction or the movie myth.
Yeah, exactly. Um, let's see, another example, and that people may be aware of in the media that portrays Judge Parker would be Clint Eastwood's Hang 'em High.
Yeah. Yeah. And
You know,
interestingly enough, I mean, between Hang 'em High and oh, Outlaw Josie Wales, Clint Eastwood's characters have been an interesting representation of the Ozarks area, even if the films themselves were not filmed in the Ozarks.
that's true. Well, and Unforgiven too, because it's specifically mentioned that that he's from Missouri, and that he had killed. Was a bank robber and killed women and children. In Missouri.
Yeah.
So uh,
Yeah.
right after
Mm.
the Civil War. So, um, there is something about that. Kind of joking, and anyone in Texas listening may not appreciate this, but um, if you look back at history, Texans were basically Missourians who ended up in trouble and moved south. I hate to tell you that, but including Austin, Alabama.
and but I think proudly so. Missouri at the time was the western frontier
Mhm.
leading up to the Civil War, and many individuals, and it really speaks heavily to the, of course, brother against brother, but the complexities and the social complexities of the Civil War, that you have villains on both sides, you have heroes on both sides, and you have an enormous number of essentially innocent people caught in between all of it.
It's
And for this area, for Southwest Missouri, individuals who, for a variety of reasons, either came to see the federal government as the enemy, or were literally on the run from the federal government for a variety of reasons.
mhm.
Texas was incredibly open and available to head to.
It really was, and but as I said, even before that, in 1820s and 1830s, when the first um, settlers went down to Mexico, because it was
Yes,
Mexico at the time,
yes,
and they left from West Plains, Missouri. I mean,
yeah,
Sam Houston and Austin, all they literally left from Missouri, and so
yeah.
um, that going to Texas or going out west is a very long-standing tradition. Jumping off
It
from
is.
here. So
It is, and and I love the fact that we've got a Texas county.
hmm and yeah,
We've got.
and that is homage to the fact that the settlers, took out from that area in general.
Mhm,
You know,
yeah,
so
which is really phenomenal. I love the concept of not only crossroads, but the idea that you could stand on for just as an example, on the old wire road and know that that was the road to Texas, for example.
exactly, exactly. I mean, well, here, down in Carthage, you could stand in front of the Kendrick House, and that was the road to Fort Scott. That was the military road,
Yes,
and so you don't think about it, but it's true.
it is incredibly, incredibly powerful. Um, um, um,
But I guess
um
we kind of got sidetracked there. But the Fort Smith, the fort is supposed to be notoriously haunted,
mhm.
and in part from the hangings and so forth, but just everything that went on there. And I think anyone that's interested in history or ghost stories would be well suited to check it out.
Yeah, definitely, definitely, definitely. I want to get down there. I've been through there, but I've not been to there.
Yeah.
Of course, we have a massively comprehensive list, and it's our short list. Uh, I'll
Probably
jump
for us too. So
jumping over to our last two on our tonight's list. The Palace Bathhouse in Eureka Springs.
okay. And I'm going to let you talk a little bit more there because I have not been there, and
I
so
I
I've heard about it, but I don't know anything personally.
I want to do more there. I've done an interview in
Hmm.
regards to the location, and of course I've been by it multiple times. It's was built at the turn of the century in Eureka Springs, of course on the wealthy Edwardian side, not on the poor folks mountain. Um, and I don't say that degradingly. I'm talking about the hillbilly help who got one mountain to live in, and the genteel rich folks got the other. Um, but the Palace Bathhouse is, of course, it's a pretty imposing stone structure, multi-floor, multi-level, and there's more levels than it appears from the street, because like everything else in Eureka Springs, it's built on the side of a hill, so
Right.
it keeps going. Today, it's a luxurious small boutique hotel slash bed and breakfast and spa, which is
Yeah.
perhaps appropriate for the bathhouse, but it has of of um, a lot of activity that is associated with it. And it is interesting to me in the sense that at the turn of the century, we tend to think of you know that we turn back time and everyone gets vastly more prim and proper and uptight. And this is coming out of the really just coming out of the Victorian era. And here in Eureka Springs, the Palace Bathhouse was, not only did it function as a bordello when it opened, but it was built as one.
Hmm.
And it was built for that purpose. And over the course of a number of decades, through into the 1940s, it was not, a masquerading as a hotel. It was a bordello.
Hmm.
And the most notable thing, not immediately notable when it was built, but the cornices, the cornerstones of the building are carved limestone, carved coarse limestone, and they're extraordinarily phallic. They're
Yeah.
you really can't avoid that. But in case you somehow missed that, there's a neon sign. It is not there's rumors that it's the oldest neon sign west of the Mississippi, and that is not true. That I'm setting the record straight right there, according to my interview with the general manager, that is not the case. However, it has been there for a very long time. I believe since the 40s, maybe into the late 30s. And the neon sign in the Palace Bathhouse is, if the cornerstones of the building were not phallic enough, the the sign is, and it lights
It,
up.
yes, I mean, yes, it sort of is the Jeff Foxworthy. If you need a sign, here's
Here's your
the sign.
sign. If you had any questions as to what the original intent of this building was. And of course, being a bordello, it has a lot of interesting and sometimes violent history.
Yes.
And so the official hauntings that I've been told about typically involve the smell of roses in one of the rooms, shadows, footsteps, disembodied voices, and the apparition of a young woman in a white gown. So some pretty
I've heard about her. I've heard stories about her. So.
there's a more anecdotal, and this was just told to me, of a couple who chose to stay there during the winter when there was hardly anyone around. And that at the time, and this was a number of years ago, so, and this was as it was told to me, so I'm not, there's my disclaimer, was that they checked in, and the person at the front desk, basically told them where they were to go, so on and so forth, and then said, if you need anything, call this number, but I'm not staying here overnight. um I'm leaving. You're going to be the only people in the hotel. If you need something, call. And I think this was like in January or February, sort of thing, very much the off season. And then apparently a situation happened in which the couple had sort of interlocked nightmares,
Hmm.
that they both experienced these nightmares. And then in the case of the woman, that she kept having this repeated nightmare of being strangled in bed.
Well, that's fun.
Yes. And so, that certainly they came away quite convinced that the location was haunted, but also came away with the sense that there had been, violence in the within the space.
Well, and a couple of things come to mind. One, often that's the case, and often those are places that violence kind of got swept under the rug, particularly in days gone by. Didn't always
Yes.
call the newspaper or the police. Um,
No.
and another thing that people will probably find shocking is that there were a number of bordellos that were built for the purpose of being bordellos. And I think people are just shocked by that because it's been illegal for so long. And even in places where it wasn't sanctioned, even in the 1800s, um, it just was, and everyone just looked the other way. Um, Railroads built them routinely, and they just called them railroad hotels, but everyone knew a railroad hotel was a bordello. And they usually had gambling as well. Um, and then in a lot of places, it was just, you know, particularly on the frontiers, and in boom towns, um, it was just good business, to be real blunt. And so
Hmm.
that was a big issue in Joplin during the mining days, and the House of Lords was the most notorious. But some people would get upset that they were staying at the Joplin Hotel or the Keystone, which both faced on it, and having to watch the prostitutes stand naked in front of the windows. Um, and the police walk by and not do anything. Why do they not do anything? But you know, it was bad
Yeah.
for to shut them down.
Yeah. Yeah.
Plus,
And,
try to keep a lid on tens of thousands of minors if you shut down the saloons and the bordellos.
yes, which was never a good idea. And
No,
I think it the assault on our sensibilities, much as the potentially the assault on the sensibilities of, say, someone from the east
hmm
coming out to the frontier,
yeah,
um, really speaks to the sense that it was a very, very different world.
it was, and not to say that those activities didn't happen in the East, but they didn't
No.
happen on Main Street.
Right. And I think, to a certain degree, I think that may be mm, one of the subconscious appeals of the concept of the frontier. This idea that we're we're interested in survival, and we are mm, rugged enough or blasé enough to accept the realities of humanity, good and bad, without trying to dress it up or pretend it's something other than it isn't.
Well, I think so. Of course, all the boom towns and frontier towns, they got to a point where they decided that, they did want to control all that. But ironically, that's usually when the boom ended.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it to a degree it speaks to the uh sort of the veneer of civilization that often gets plastered over
Yes.
some much more ugly realities.
Um, I don't know that realities really change. We just pretend they do, and
Yeah.
pretend that we are shocked. And
Yes.
maybe some people
It's a,
really are because they don't see it. But
mhm.
realities, the same sort of realities exist in all times. It's just how aware you are and how prominent different ones are at different times. And
Yes,
um, but we often pretend otherwise.
we do. Very, very often. And sometimes, sometimes to our benefit, sometimes very much not to our benefit.
That's very true. That's very true. But I guess I tend to fall on the side of blinders do not help you in the long run.
No, certainly not. I don't think in the long run, especially um, when you start, if you're going to honestly face history, at some point you have to face yourself.
Yes, and that's often hard to do, and I think that's part of what's going on in some of the discussions today about revisionism and so forth, and um, not wanting to accept that certain things in the past happened. Um,
Yeah,
and and I think that's because we've gone through a period where a lot of people just wanted to pretend everything, something bad in the past just miraculously, you know, it, the issues don't exist. And so people end up in little boxes and they don't know how to react. And that may upset some people, but um,
well,
you have
and
to accept history for what it was.
yes, and I think it's important to note and I agree with you 100%. And I think it's important to know that if someone is upset about that, that they have to understand the context from which we're coming. There
Hmm.
have been extraordinarily, of course, I love history. You love history.
Okay.
Um, that goes probably without saying, but I said it anyway. Uh, but throughout history, there have been truly horrible things that human beings have done to other human beings.
Yes.
And it is only through a very, I don't want to say cynical, but I do want to say very hard, authentic look at our past do we begin to learn and do we begin to tentatively hope that we can begin to affect positive change.
Exactly. And and that is, all of this is kind of wrapped up together. And this past is some of this noir history that we talk about are things that either people just never knew, or oh, this was exaggerated, or those kind of things never happened, but they did.
They did. They really did. And and that's where and certainly there's a comment, well, some things just need to be put in the history books and left as it is. And and I'll use ghost tours as an example,
Hmm.
that sometimes it's crucially important to shift the history out of a textbook and put it out there in the real world, where in all fairness, some individuals can be offended by it or find it problematic. And of course, you and I, in various levels, have dealt with situations in which folks took umbrage with a
Yeah.
ghost tour in their region or whatever,
Yeah.
because we don't have ghosts, or ghosts are problematic, or ghosts aren't ghosts, they're demons, and we don't need to be talking about them,
Yeah.
and all of those things. And that first of all, going on a genuine tour is one of learning the region's history, learning the what went on, a glimpse into what is a very rich tapestry of our an individual's community. And then beyond that, coming away with a really enriched understanding of local history in a way
Mhm.
that becomes personal.
Exactly. Exactly. Um, it always reminds me, so many of these discussions are going on these days. It reminds me of my something my mother said once. It was referencing someone in the family who made the comment to me that she always read certain authors who, and they tended to be from the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and just said because she knew that if she picked up one of their books, she wasn't going to be confronted with something that she might be offended with. And which to me was sort of this almost alien concept of why would you, bother reading it, And later my mother just said, "Oh my, it must be pathetic to be that fragile that you can't read something."
Oh, it's and and again, I think one of the great appeals of the motif or the archetype of the frontier is a ruggedness that is willing to, not need a fainting couch, so to speak.
Yes. Didn't have time to faint, someone might kill you.
Exactly. It's not an option. And deeply inspired by stories, and these stories of survival, these stories of heroism, even more so when I know that they're true, and
Right.
that in a situation, it's like I know that to such a large degree, my early 21st century lifestyle is such that I'm soft, and I probably would have been, left for the vultures to pick off along the wagon train, because I know that I'm not where they were, but really extraordinary that human beings could do that, and inspiring that it is possible.
It really is. And our comfortable lifestyle now is not very far removed in time, and that's what's amazing to me too.
It is. Now, in terms of uncomfortable topics, but also, potentially quite juicy, because it has been featured in a number you know, of documentation, multimedia, is a location in the Ozarks
Mhm,
that is near the St. Louis Metroplex,
mhm.
and it's known as the Screaming House. And author Stephen LaChance covered it rather extensively because he lived there.
Yes, yes. He's not the only one that had experiences there, but he did live through it. And Stephen is a personal friend of mine, known him for years. And he went through a very harrowing experience. He was not involved with the paranormal or anything prior to this. Actually, that experience is what prompted him to start researching and ultimately writing books. Um, and looking at it, I think he has said the same, that one, the people who had lived there before had gone through pretty intense hauntings, which he didn't know about. Um, but I think it was a combination of what was there plus the circumstances that he was in coming into the home, just like we talked about earlier about your state of mind and so forth.
Hmm.
He had recently gone through a divorce, and was raising his three children on his own, three young children. So, he was at a very emotional point in his life, moves in, hoping that this is sort of a, new start, new beginnings. And very quickly, activity begins, and seems focused on the children as well as he, to the point that I can't remember exactly how long they were there. It wasn't very long, a couple of
Hmm.
months or something, 2 or 3 months, picking up the kids and literally running out of the house and not going back.
Yeah.
And then another person, the next people who lived there also went through the haunting. And ultimately, the haunting was determined to be demonic by the Catholic Church.
Yes. And that, which is pretty unusual.
extremely unusual. Uh, Unlike, portrayals in the movies or The Exorcist, etc. Demons are not standing on every corner, or making themselves known anyway. Um, and so, and they tend to be different kinds of hauntings. In fact, the one at the Union House, I would say, is a little different than some of the demonic hauntings because it escalated pretty quickly. Because usually um, it's things that do happen over time, start subtly, and then the activity grows that seems to take control of the thoughts and mind and the body of the person.
Hmm.
But I think that may be because it had already um, been active with people who've been there before, perhaps. Um, and People involved there ended up with health problems. Um, it was very oppressive. Um, and, People kind of, trek to it, want to experience it. Um, it's one thing to go on a ghost tour. It's one thing to go to some haunted places that have activity, but I I don't quite understand just sort of the hobbyist or someone just interested in that experience to say, I want to go to a demonic haunting. Um,
Agreed.
you know,
Agreed.
that's uh, that's more of a adrenaline rush than most people really want. It's kind of like saying I want to go on a roller coaster, but instead I end up being a mercenary or something.
Yeah. It's, and I think that, and sort of this discussion might be a good place to close, but something that, well, okay, so we've talked about, not in this episode, but we've talked about the Iwa. We've talked about information that Native American shaman elders have imparted to you,
Mhm.
talked to you about, um, and of course, traditional um, First Nation belief structures still do have shamans,
Yes,
um, which I think is very, very important. In that, there is, of course, the 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 acceptance and the understanding that there's a wide variety of supernatural beings. There's a wide variety of paranormal experiences, and some that you learn from, some you take with a grain of salt, some that no pun intended, some that you simply accept as part of, for lack of a better word, the natural world, the natural rhythm of things. And at the same time, that there are some things that you do not engage with or you avoid.
exactly. Not everything is worth running in and saying boo and come chase me. Um, and knowing the differences, that discernment of knowing which things to leave alone, um, and be wary of, I think is the biggest part of wisdom. Um,
Yeah.
and with the Union House, it was a matter that of walking in and having no idea that, you know, it was going on Stephen's part when he moved in.
Yes.
Um, on the other hand, say, I just want to go experience this, or I can handle it, or whatever,
Yes.
um, without a background, especially without a background um, of dealing with these kind of issues, is just foolish.
It is.
I
It
mean,
is.
go ride the roller coaster.
Go ride the roller coaster. Absolutely. Go ride it twice.
Yeah.
Uh,
Um,
it to me it really speaks of the height, not only the height of hubris, but the height of sort of modern day American arrogance, in the
Mhm.
idea that you envision it to be cool, so you're going to go engage in something that is potentially, important disclaimer there, potentially ancient, unseen, and malevolent.
And powerful.
Yes.
You know, if you're assuming all those things, then by virtue you have to admit that it is very powerful. And
Hmm.
and I think the sort of the attitude and viewpoint that gets people to that point of wanting to do that without the necessary background is sort of the flip side of what we were talking about the frontier. It's, I hate to say it, it's the bad or the negative side of the cowboy myth
Yes.
that
Yes.
I
And
can walk out on the street and face down anything at high noon.
yes.
Um, and it doesn't work that way. It didn't work that way in the old West, and it doesn't work that way in these issues either.
No. And as Carl Jung noted rather expressively, every archetype has a shadow. There's a
Yes.
toxic dark expression of every positive or necessary archetype, and that's one of them. I think part of the motif that is also appealing about the great American cowboy archetype is that the arrogant dumb ones got shot quickly, and
Hmm.
that's not necessarily 100% on the historical record, but certainly in terms of the concept of the archetype, is you
Hmm.
do dumb things, win dumb prizes.
That's right. And that's why most of them didn't live very long.
Yes. And go play with the wrong stuff, and you know there's not necessarily any guarantee that that's going to come out well.
But if you are interested, then by all means look up Stephen LeChance's books. He's written a couple on the Union House,
Yes.
and get your information from there. But I certainly I don't know if it's being occupied at this point. It has been off and on over the years, but no, it's not a house to just walk up and knock on the door and
No.
start asking questions
and
without any
and
back.
those Yes. Then those locations exist scattered. Not They're not terribly common, but they are scattered around the world.
Yeah, there are, and perhaps that's good to kind of remind us of humility and the dangers of arrogance.
It is, and I think that's a delightfully sobering place to probably close up for the evening.
I think so. I think so. Well, I had a lot of fun.
I did too. I hope everybody else did. This was a lot of fun.
It really was. And we'll be back next week. And not sure what we'll be talking about, but talking
We
about
welcome
if you
we
if you have ideas you want us to talk about, let us know, and we will try to work
100%.
them in.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you get to listen to whatever we decide is interesting at the moment.
That's right. That's right. And perhaps a combination thereof. So we thank everybody for watching, and of course, Lisa, thank you, and thanks to Benton for all of his technical expertise to put all of these pieces together so that we're actually online.
Yes, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Josh, and thanks, Benton. And we'll see you all next week.
All righty.